I had been abusing methamphetamine pills for the past 2 years or so. Things had really started to get out of control during the last few months. My relationship was falling apart and my partner asked me to leave our home until I was clean. I had nowhere to go, so I took all of my belongings and drove 8 hours to a friend's house. I had many misadventures along the way, but that is part of a different story. Unbeknownst to me, my friend was also a recovering stimulant addict. He also is a medical professional and a fellow psychonaut. We took LSD and shrooms together over the course of 3 days. Without judgment, this friend of mine showed me how to use the power of psychedelics in ways I'd never been able to achieve on my own. He gently guided me to confront my addiction issues, and by the time I left his home 1 week later, I had dumped my entire stash and was committed to never touching any drugs other than weed or psychs ever again, or so I thought. I came home to my partner, who accepted me with open arms, as long as I could stay clean. She said she had the man she fell in love with back. I started a new job a few weeks later. This is when I should have spotted the warning signs that I may have been a bit overconfident in my abilities to beat this addiction overnight. Once I got back into the daily grind, getting up at 5 a.m. and working every single day, I didn't have any cravings for stimulants. However, I was still craving something. I was smoking at least an eighth of weed a day. I started to take kratom every day before work to get up and moving early in the morning. I would typically order my drugs online from plugs I had met over the years. I was looking for a good price and some good weed and took a chance ordering from a vendor that I was familiar with, but had not done much business with in the past. This is where everything starts to fall apart again. I got the package in the mail, and when I opened it, I was surprised to find about a quarter bag of crystal meth. I contacted the vendor, who had some bullshit excuse about how he mixed up his packs and he would reship my weed. This vendor knew that I was trying to get clean off of stims, and he told me I should flush the bag immediately. I should have taken his advice. Of course, I did not. My plan was to sell his bag to an acquaintance and make some extra money, so I held on to it for a few days until I could meet up with the guy and make the sale. The next morning, crawling out of bed at 5 a.m., my old addict brain possessed me again. Might as well just have a little line before work, one last hurrah, no one will know but you, and plus you're getting rid of it all in a couple days anyway. I did a small line, felt that old familiar feeling kick in. Even while I was chopping up the line, I remember thinking to myself, this is a horrible mistake, but the addict side won. After work, I decided to redose. I cut up a fat line this time. I did not have much experience with pure crystal and was used to taking pressed pills. I'm not sure how much I actually dosed the second time, but I knew as soon as it went up my nose that it was way too much. I didn't sleep that night, but I had been overstimmed so many times. I knew that as long as I didn't redose, I'd get through the day and be able to crash the second night. No sleep came the second night either, or the third night. That is when I became concerned because the meth should have been out of my system by then. It was on the evening of the fourth day that the hallucinations began. The first thing I remember is laying on my bed and reaching for a cup of water on my nightstand. I went to grab it and my hand passed right through. The strangest confusion washed over me. I tried to grab it again, and even though I could see the cup clear as day, my hand passed through like Patrick Swayze in Ghost. I looked away and looked back, and the cup was still there. Even when I knew it was a hallucination, I could not unsee it. Then the shadow people. Creeping out of my closet in the corners of my bedroom were the outlines of these entities slowly floating toward me. They looked like they were wearing hoodies and had no faces, but they felt intelligent and I could sense nothing but pure evil emanating from them. I started getting really worried and figured I should probably go to the hospital, but this meant I had to confess to my partner. I'd gone behind her back and relapsed. I'd been playing it off as if I was sick up to this point, but decided I needed to confess. I told her I believed I had entered meth-induced psychosis and I might need to go to the hospital. She was very upset with me. We weighed the pros and cons of going to the emergency room. I didn't want to be locked up in a mental ward and knew if I was able to just fall asleep, I would wake up right as rain. My partner was so upset with me, she basically said I put myself in this situation, and if I want to go to the hospital, then I can call for an ambulance myself. I should mention that I probably downplayed the severity of my psychosis as to not freak her out and to lessen the blow of having broken my promise to stay clean once again to her. I decided I would try to sleep it off one more night. This is when I truly broke away and lost all touch with the real world. I remember thinking that my friend had directed a movie that he never told me about, and it was on YouTube, and I decided to put it on. The plot had something to do with multiple intersecting stories of these characters trying to survive an apocalyptic event. There was some kind of huge explosion that decimated most of the earth. To my delight, my friend had based one of the characters in the film on me and another one of our friends. He also had based a character on himself. My character had called my two friends and we made plans to meet at his house and try to ride out the apocalypse together. This slowly started to change perspectives. I was no longer watching the plot unfold in a movie. I was now experiencing the movie as the character that was based on myself. I met up with one friend we can call Phil by somehow transporting to his house, and then we drove to my other friend's home we can call Bob, who lived in another city. When we got to his house, we entered through a side door. He lived in an attached duplex, and next to him lived an elderly black couple and their two grandchildren. We did not make any contact with them yet, but I could see everything that was unfolding in their home as well, sort of like I was switching back and forth between first person and movie mode. We decided to hunker down and smoke some weed at Bob's house. The next thing I remember, I could see the entire destroyed Earth reconstruct itself. The world went from complete ruin back to normal in a matter of seconds, and there was some sense that this was a digital world like when you die in a video game and then restart at the save point. However, we didn't get to rejoin the world, and we were stuck in this apocalyptic dimension, looking down over the pristine Earth that went about its business as if nothing happened. All of the people who had died in the apocalypse were reset in the exact positions that they were in when the world ended, and were none the wiser anything had occurred at all. This included alternate versions of ourselves that got to finish living our lives while we were trapped in this purgatory. It turns out that the family that lived next to Bob were trapped in purgatory with us as well. There is an entire subplot that is very fuzzy to me now that involved us going back to Earth and murdering our own replacements and living out their lives, but each time we did, the apocalypse would happen again and we would end up in the exact situation. After some kind of eternity, myself, Phil, Bob, and Bob's neighbors had all accepted our fates. We were trapped in purgatory in this desolate wasteland forever. Then a new plot development occurred. The old man that lived next to Bob used to be a brilliant engineer and had all sorts of blueprints and science books in his basement. He had regretted wasting his life away with drinking and had let his great mind go to waste. Additionally, Bob and the oldest daughter that lived next door ended up having children, and somehow their children had children. We had used the old man's books and blueprints to reinvent the battery. We were then able to harness electricity and use it to watch the film that I thought my friend Phil had directed, which was the delusion I was currently living out. The old man preached to his children and great-grandchildren about how they should not waste their brains and to not follow in his footsteps. Then he would tell tales of the old world and would show the film. Some time had passed and we had repopulated this desolate land with hundreds of people, but they were all deformed from inbreeding and they didn't look completely human. They resembled something like orcs from the Lord of the Rings. They turned watching Phil's movie into a sort of ritual, and eventually an entire religion was built upon it. Meanwhile, the old man passed away, but the youngest of his granddaughters continued to work endlessly on one of the inventions he had written a blueprint for. This device was completed, and then we somehow used it to open a portal down to Earth. Another device was invented that created glowing orbs that were human souls. It became our job to create all the new souls and send them down to Earth. These souls knew of Phil's movie and of us, and we became the gods and goddesses of a new religion for all of humanity. One of the orbs was the Messiah, and we put Jesus on Earth. Our intentions were always good, and we hoped for peace. After thousands of years, we had finally somehow figured out how to get to heaven. We had been trapped in limbo for so long. Heaven was through some sort of portal, and when you went through, you would stay there for 10,000 years and then return. The catch was that you can only go one time, but the experience was pure bliss and ecstasy. I didn't want to experience heaven without my partner and our son, so I had to wait for them to die and join me in limbo. They said when they finally came, it was magical, and I sobbed when I saw them again, and we all walked into heaven together. The next thing I remember, the movie was over, and I was very confused. I kept peeking out the blinds to see if the outside world looked normal, or if the apocalypse had actually happened. I assumed that it must have happened, and that I was now in heaven with my partner, as she was laying next to me. I woke her up and tried to explain to her that we were dead and to not go outside. I still don't think she understood the extent of my psychosis at that point, because I could recognize her and where I was, and she got up and went to work. The series of the next set of delusions are all sort of jumbled together. I'm not sure if they were happening simultaneously or if I was experiencing them in some sort of linear fashion. For a time, I was living at my father's house. He had modified his home to fit a strange new lifestyle. This involved being in constant flow with the sun. You would wake up each day and look into a mirror that reflected sunlight into your eyes for 20 seconds immediately each morning. When you slept, you would be snuggled against this strange pliable rod that would keep you in constant motion, rolling you over slowly. You would sleep every 4 hours for an hour. There was an alarm system that went off and played the same song when it was time to wake up. The song was by some really popular teeny bopper band that dressed up in Barney-style creature costumes. When you were not sleeping, you would be outside in constant sunlight. There were activities you would do until the sleep alarm went off. Each activity involved some sort of sun ritual-based exercise. At one point, I was trying to sleep on the couch that had an electric stovetop inside of the cushions. I kept turning it on and burning myself, and it was painful and terrifying. There was a tractor on my father's property, and I took it for a joyride at night. I drove into town and stumbled upon a festival that seemed to be related to a holiday like Thanksgiving. All of the townspeople were gathered along the main street. I came across a group of police officers on a tall hill above the crowd. There was a giant pig they had on a leash. They were going to have a stuntman ride the pig down the hill and into the crowd of people. This was some kind of tradition that was held annually. I took it upon myself to hop on the pig and took it for an exhilarating joyride. The cops found it amusing, and the crowd all cheered when I made it all the way down the hill. I made a big speech into a microphone and then went back to the house. They had captured the entire thing on film, and I was able to share it with my family. This is when my fiancée may have returned home because she was there with me at my dad's house. She kept telling me that it wasn't my dad's house, and I would be confused, and it would turn back into our house for just a moment and then back to my dad's. This is when I could feel my brain start to melt. I started to lose all cognitive function. It felt like an invalid. I was convinced I would have to live the rest of my life this way, or until I became a vegetable. Then my brother showed up. He was using some kind of drug and had moved into my house to take care of me. I kept finding dirty needles all over the place. I didn't trust him. I then walked into my room and caught him in bed with my partner, and they both had a dirty look of guilt on their faces. I'd lost most of my brain by then, and was aware that I was very confused. I was convinced I just walked in on my own brother with my woman and began to get very upset. My fiancée was insisting it didn't happen and said she had to take me to the hospital. I thought she was lying. I wouldn't go with her. I then decided to call my mother because she would know the truth. I called, and luckily she answered and told me that my partner would never do that to me and that I should trust her and go to the hospital. I remember a brief scene in the waiting room, trying to tell the person at the desk my personal information. I couldn't remember my name, my social, or what I had taken. Then I remember sitting in a chair and holding my brain in my lap. It was no longer attached to my head. My perspective was from my waist looking up. Then I was planning a meetup with my old friends Phil and Bob again in Disney World. There was a secret floor you can get off on an elevator there on one of the rides that no one knows about. You have to swim underwater to get there. I was in the hospital, but the hospital felt like a jail and I was laying in my bed. The hospital was also located in Disney. I would wait for my friends to get there. This room I was in had a strange familiarity, as if I'd been there one time before. I was alone in a bed with a television and an old-fashioned radio. One wall was barred like a jail cell, and it was nighttime. I caught out of the corner of my eye these tiny moving people. They were my friends there to meet me, along with other people I didn't know. They had shrunk themselves, swam through an underground tunnel, and then taken an elevator into my room. They needed to get something and I helped them by letting them climb across my body. They thanked me by eating the dead skin off my arm on a recent wound that had begun to scab over. They were very happy I had helped them and then went back the way they had came. The next day they visited again. However, this time they were wheeled into my room by an orderly. They stood in a circle on top of a cot, holding curtains around themselves to hide. I entered the curtain to discover they were all nude. They were selling drugs and weapons. 2 of them had rats that lived off of their flesh and never left their bodies, like a parasite. They would nest in their pubic hair. They thought it would be exciting to take me on their drug run through the hospital, so they all stood around my bed. This was a carefully orchestrated operation. The orderly was in on the deal, would come retrieve the cot and bring it from unit to unit to sell contraband to the residents. Then I was back in my room at night again. My friend had shrunken themselves and entered my room. They gave me a potion to shrink myself, and we escaped through a crack in the old-fashioned radio. We took an elevator that opened into a body of water. The potion allowed us to breathe underwater, but it only lasted a short while. Under my floor, we surfaced into a secret chamber. This was a secret place where they had a huge stash of drugs hidden. We were going to take the drugs and then go on all the rides in Disney World. Then the cops showed up. We were all interviewed separately by a woman. Phil then turned out to be an officer as well and had to play it off like he was working undercover, even though he was really committing the crime with us. He then tried to interrogate Bob and I about how the drugs got there and pin it on us. We both knew that he supplied the bulk of the drugs. He finally felt so guilty that he broke down in tears and confessed. We were all arrested. At first, Bob fled the scene, but they caught him. They put us in 3 rooms in the top of a building. I kept walking into the wrong room every time I wanted to use the restroom and was reprimanded. They kept saying, "Nope, that's not your room. It's this one right here." Phil and I slept the whole time. However, Bob lost his shit. It turned out he had a mental disability and started screaming nonsense and crying like a baby. I thought it might have been some sort of defense mechanism to deny what was happening around him. I remember being envious that he was able to escape reality and the complete horror when realizing the situation I had gotten into. Drug charges, prison, armed guards. I slept, and then I ate a meal and slept more. Then I wake up and they tell me I'm going home. I am in a hospital. I'm on the phone with my partner and she will be here in a few minutes. I check out of the hospital with a discharge sheet reading psychosis, unspecified type, and to make an appointment with my PCP within 3 days. I was so confused for the first couple of weeks. Writing this has been extremely therapeutic for me. In reality, I was only out of the hospital in psychosis for about 5 hours and then spent the next 4 days in a hospital bed. None of that happened. I was a lunatic, ranting and raving to myself. I am able to find some strength in my mental fortitude. I know that was a delusion. It is feeling more and more like a dream each day that passes. I have been extremely humbled. This experience has changed me forever. I value my sanity and my mental health so much more now. I am dedicated to finally dealing with my addiction issues and treating my mental and physical health like a temple. Please let this be a warning sign. Meth is a terrible drug, and stimulants in general are playing with fire for anyone with an addictive personality type. My advice is to just stay away. I know I will never touch it again. Around 2.5 years ago, my narcissistic mother finally decided to do something about my anorexia. I'd been eating around 500 calories a day for more than a year, and she chose to ignore my scary weight loss, said that she simply didn't notice at all. I weighed 33 kilograms or 72 pounds, and was 166 centimeters or 5 foot 4.5 inches tall at the time. I also had body dysmorphia. I still do. My organs were basically failing. I had a lot of heart issues, super low heart rate, arrhythmia, and very low blood pressure. And after we visited a private hospital, my mother was told that I needed to be hospitalized as soon as possible. Unfortunately, it was a holiday. A lot of staff members had allegedly not shown up to work, and they told us that I should come back and prepare for inpatient tomorrow because due to lack of enough staff, I cannot be admitted. Yeah, I know, Bulgaria. Instead of going back the next day and getting the help that I needed, my mother rang my aunt, who's a pharmacist. She gave us a referral to a psychiatrist that she knew. I didn't visit a psychologist or anything like that beforehand. So we go to said psychiatrist's office, and he unfortunately happened to be a complete idiot. I remember this situation vividly because I was so outraged by his and my mother's behavior. I felt like the least crazy person in the room, although I was technically a walking skeleton. He only asked me why I wasn't eating, and I said that I don't want to. What else could he expect from someone who is anorexic? He looked incredibly disinterested, and it looked like he had some other things to get done too, and further asked me any other questions. He basically just started laughing and said that I'll need to start taking Risperidone daily and start eating immediately, or else he'll arrange compulsory treatment in one of the public psych wards in the city. You can feel free to Google what the Bulgarian ones look like, and I obviously couldn't say no. I had a suicidal friend that went to one of them, got molested multiple times by someone from the staff there, and overall got even more traumatized and depressed. The minute he got out of there, he overdosed. Thankfully, he survived, but I was so scared that I could not only be admitted and force-fed, but also abused, so I decided to take the Risperidone and try to secretly continue eating low-calorie until my mother stops paying attention once again. On my way home, I looked up what the drug's purpose is on Google, and I thought it was weird that I was being prescribed an antipsychotic. I told my mother that this is something that's typically prescribed to people with schizophrenia or some kind of a psychosis, and told her that the side effects list is a mile long, but she unsurprisingly didn't really care. I was prescribed 2 milligrams and used it for 7 months. I cannot begin to describe how terrible I felt when I was on the drug. I've seen some online reviews saying that they've helped a lot of people with schizophrenia and that they didn't have a lot of side effects, although there were a bunch of ones saying that they did really have bad long-term effects and it made them feel even worse. But I've never had anything to do with schizophrenia in the first place. First of all, I felt drugged out of my mind, and I don't mean drugged in a feeling better type of way, although I wouldn't know because I haven't ever done drugs. I still thought I was incredibly ugly and fat. It's just that I was in a 24/7 zombie state and I simply couldn't think a lot, or at all most of the time. My thoughts were very slowed and often confusing because I'd forget what I was thinking about 30 seconds beforehand all the time. I just had this constant brain fog. I was nauseous, wanted to sleep all the time, even when I had to go to school, etc. I kept losing my balance and control over my body. I remember falling a bunch of times, and I was outrageously dizzy. I made 289,482 complaints to my mother, to my aunt, to the doctor, and a bunch of other family members who didn't really care either, so there was no way for me to not take the drug. My mother was forcing me to, and I was 16 at the time. I ended up dropping out of school for a year because I was falling asleep during class constantly, and the teachers thought that I was, these are their words in a document's transcript, heavily drugged. And I pretty much was, but since everyone at school hated me anyways, they started spreading rumors about having seen me do coke and heroin and getting drunk, which has never happened. So when the teachers heard, they voted to kick me out of school. My mother obviously did not defend me. My abusive stepfather sure as hell wouldn't have defended me either, and my biological father is dead, so I ended up spending the next 6 months at home mainly sleeping, some days all day long, doing nothing and feeling super dissociated and numb. I don't remember most of the things I've been doing either. There are a lot of gaps in my memory, but I'm not particularly worried about that because my mother used to isolate me and keep me home all the time. I do remember that my goal was to eat as little as possible, and that I did everything in my power to remain eating very low calorie though, and I did. As terribly hard as it was for me to think logically, I genuinely tried to understand why I was rapidly gaining weight despite eating so little, because I was sure that I was eating around 600 calories a day. I didn't even have to count them. People that deal with anorexia are pros at religiously maintaining some kind of a routine, not eating foods in portions that exceed an X amount of calories. I still am aware of how much calories I eat a day, despite the fact that I've not even tried counting them on purpose anymore. I was eating 2 to 3 apples a day, 200 to 300 calories, a palm-sized piece of skinless chicken breast, 150 to 250 calories, and something very low-calorie for dinner, lettuce with a tablespoon of olive oil or 50-calorie diet pudding. I was super detached and couldn't think properly most of the time, but I still fought with all of my energy, or the lack thereof, to strictly follow that diet because I knew that I was drugged as hell and that if I ended up gaining a lot of weight, I'd probably kill myself after I got off of it. I had been diagnosed with depression and BDD by a psychologist prior to becoming anorexic, and I was feeling suicidal often before the drug. I knew for a fact that I'd rather die than gain weight. One might assume that it was these issues, suicidal thoughts, depression, anorexia, BDD, that made the psychiatrist believe that I should be medicated with something as terrible as risperidone, but he didn't know any of it, excluding the obvious eating disorder. He didn't ask me any questions other than the "why the hell aren't you eating?" before prescribing me the drug, and none of my family members knew about my other mental health problems either, so no one could have possibly told him anything about these things beforehand. Even if they had, which is impossible because they didn't know, isn't it his job to do a proper and careful evaluation? And at the end of the day, growing up, I was sexually assaulted more times than I can count. I had grown so accustomed to it that at one point I had completely stopped realizing that it isn't okay for people to be groping me, and etc. My mother is the most narcissistic person I've ever met. She has always abused me physically and emotionally, and keeps blatantly denying it. In front of everyone else, she always used to act like the best parent in the world, but the minute she stepped through the door at home, she'd be screaming at me and throwing stuff at me. My stepfather is also a misogynistic, abusive idiot. My mom allowed him to hit me all the time. He would beat me up if I were to paint my nails, for example, because in his opinion, it was slutty, and constantly said things like, "You look like a prostitute with this skirt," etc., which led me to not being able to tell him or my mother about the sexual assault I've been dealing with, and it made me blame myself for these terrible situations for the longest time. My dad was shot at home when I was 6, and no one told me about it. Luckily, I was at my grandparents' house at the time. I literally found out about it through the news and didn't even tell my mom because I, yes, 6-year-old me, didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable and wonder what to tell me. So when she found out through someone else that I'd found out, she never even brought it up or my dad ever again, up until I became 10 years old. And no, she didn't just bring it up. She simply started using "you're exactly like your idiot father" as an insult out of nowhere. I mean, the psychiatrist could have asked so many questions that would have directly led him to the explanation behind my obvious sickness and other psychological problems that he didn't even know about, but he couldn't bother doing his job properly. And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but when your mental health issues are directly caused by or related to your environment, why would you even prescribe a drug in the first place? Even if it were to help me, which it didn't. I didn't have psychosis-related problems beforehand, and all this medicine did was make me fat and ruin my life. Wouldn't I go back to square one after I eventually stopped taking the drug? And yes, my situation was critical, but I was already willing to be tube-fed. I had already agreed on going to the private hospital that next day and start visiting a psychologist, although I was sure I'd relapse again after I got home. So why would he give risperidone to me, and why an antipsychotic? Before you ask, No, I didn't come across as obviously troubled and obnoxious, as I'm being right now in this post in front of him. I just gave him a bland, "I don't know," answer to his, "Why aren't you eating?" But I made sure to not appear too disoriented or depressed, and if he were to ask me whether I was willing to recover, whether I do something about my situation, I would have said that I will for the sake of not having to take any drugs. The fact that he didn't even ask me that, or anything really, is still baffling to me. Anyways, back to the side effects. My stupid mother surprisingly eventually started fighting with my psychiatrist, like she ends up doing with everyone else, because we had to visit him since she had been talking to him about me complaining about the horrific side effects of the drug, and his brilliant idea was to increase my dosage, but he said that he should see me in order to decide first. Not only that she kept canceling, I never ended up seeing him after I first met him, but she eventually stopped replying to his emails too. I remember this only because she was complaining about it every single day for months in a row. And all of a sudden she was like, "Ugh, this idiot keeps telling me that we can't continue the treatment if we don't visit him, so I'm just not going to give it to you anymore." And yes, you guessed it, she made me quit cold turkey. I'd been taking it for 6 to 7 months. I really don't know who the hell lied about Risperidone not being addictive, because the withdrawal phase was very real and horrific. I was sweating, my body was shaking, I had emotional breakdowns 24/7, I felt sick and overall incredibly suicidal. Now, I do realize that I shouldn't have stopped using it so abruptly and that I could have potentially passed out, but I genuinely didn't have any say in it. I even thought that I was going to actually die at one point, around 2 weeks after I stopped it. My heart felt like it was going to explode and I couldn't breathe properly. I don't know what actually happened. It could have been a panic or anxiety attack that was caused by the withdrawal effects too, but it was scary. And I told my parents that I literally feel like I'm going to pass out and that I need to go to the hospital, but my mother ignored me and my stepfather just laughed in my face, so I wouldn't know what actually happened to me. I did some research about antipsychotics' withdrawal effect and long-term side effects, and companies and psychiatrists deny anything like that, but it seems like their explanation always is based on the fact that theoretically it isn't proven that antipsychotics could be addictive or may have some permanent or very long-lasting side effects, but I found zero proof that the opposite is true either. The fact that these companies prescribe drugs that are so strong without having done medical research about potential brain damage, the long-term side effects that may occur years after a person gets off the drug, etc., seems completely diabolical. And no, I don't mean the terrible side effects that I experienced the first 2 to 3 weeks, which are very obviously caused by me abruptly stopping. It's been 2 years now, and I still feel zombified. I've never had the luxury to be able to sit down, focus on something, and properly study because of my mother's constant screaming at me and blaming me for everything out of nowhere. But fortunately, I used to have an incredible memory. I would go to school and barely pay any attention to what the teacher's discussing and having memorized everything that we discussed in the class. If we didn't cover something during the school, I'd just open my books, read what I had to learn once or twice, write down 2 to 3 sentences that include the most important part of what I have to learn, and I'd show up at school the next day having learned everything perfectly. It isn't because what we were studying was easy. There were some very intelligent students who struggle with learning everything on time because the Bulgarian school system really is terrible, and in most cases, they never ended up getting a 6, our equivalent of an A letter grade, even though some of them spent all their free time attending private lessons. I also changed many schools. It was always the same thing. The only thing that used to give me confidence was my intelligence. It actually took a while for me to see it as a good thing too, because looking back at it now, I kind of felt like a fraud and undeserving of always having perfect grades, etc., because I wasn't putting any effort in it, and others who actually did rarely ever got the grade they wanted. And I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal. I'm being completely honest when I say that the only reason why I hadn't committed suicide is because I've always been very empathetic and caring for other people. A lot of my depression was actually rooted in not only my issues. I genuinely just feel sad when I think about how many terrible things happen to children and people who haven't done anything wrong in third world countries, for example, which made me feel even shittier because it made me realize that I was still very comparatively lucky, but instead of it making me feel better and more humble, it made me even more depressed because I was mad at myself for being depressed. At the end of the day, I address the fact that I don't live in a country where people are being massacred. I have access to clean water, food, a nice place to stay. I can get all the education in the world and use my overwhelmingly overly analytical brain that won't shut up to make some kind of a change and help the ones who don't have a voice, who would do anything in the world to place themselves in my position. But guess what? Risperidone completely fucked my brain up. It's very hard to explain it. I have this constant brain fog that never gets away. It's kind of flu-like, except it's also messing up with my thought process a lot too, and directly affecting my capability to process information. I still manage to think very logically. I still analyze situations and think deeply about things, but it's so much harder. It's kind of like, not that I feel like I cannot do it anymore at all. It's a bit of a barrier feeling, but you can recognize said barrier, that there's something that's preventing you from saying or thinking about what you want to do or say easily, and you need to push through harder, which is exactly what I was feeling like while I was taking the drug. I don't memorize things as easily anymore. I still study relatively quickly, but there's a huge difference that bothers me a lot. When I started seeing the effects of the antipsychotic wearing off, despite all the terrible side effects, I was kind of looking forward to the future and decided to keep on going because I just wanted to get over all of this and finally regain my normal state of mind. But for around a year, I've been feeling the same way. There's literally zero progress. The brain fry effect is still there. It's not prominent enough to the point where I don't know what the hell I'm doing or I cannot think properly, but there is such a huge difference between my usual self and what's left of me. And since the minimal amount of self-confidence that I had was solely based on my intelligence, I've been feeling outrageously lost. Words cannot describe how hard it was for me to find one thing that I didn't completely hate about myself, given how much I despised and still despise myself as a whole. I had finally found it. It literally saved me from that perspective, only for an idiot to prescribe a medicine that wasn't even suitable for me to begin with and take it away from me. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that antipsychotics help some people with schizophrenia, and I'm glad that they do, but they should only be prescribed to people who really need something to help them with their psychosis, and everyone should be told about the side effects, possible long-term damage, and most importantly, these things need to be researched in the first place. It's easy to see why they haven't been. After all, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's hard for people who are literally considered as clinically crazy to prove that these drugs have messed them up. But the fact that I mentally felt more whole and my cognitive functions were overall working better when I was an actual starving skeleton is crazy. And no, this isn't some kind of a projection or delusion, because I do admit that my weight being so low made me feel miserable and physically sick. I mean, I needed to carry around pillows to put under my bony ass in the car or at the sofa, or lack thereof, so that I don't get bruised because of how prominently my bones were sticking out, for fuck's sake. And I had hair all over my body, my breath was terrible, my cheeks were sunken in, my hair almost completely fell out, my nails were breaking and my nail beds were falling out, yes literally. I felt like I was gonna pass out or die anytime soon, and I was so cold I had to wear 5 layers of shirts and pants during the summer, the hypothermia. And while I felt weak and unhealthy, I was still me on the inside. I don't feel like that anymore. I may be healthy on the outside, yes, all my blood tests are perfect, etc., but the Risperidone almost completely dehumanized me. I feel like my personality was strapped out of me. I was depressed before too, and I was in a very critical physical condition, but I still had some moments where I could enjoy myself for a while, even if it was only for 5 minutes. Now I just either feel outrageously numb, zombie-like, foggy, and empty all the time, or simply depressed. And the fact that I feel like I lack the ability to feel any kind of an enjoyment or happiness in itself is what makes me also even more depressed, because I want to break through it. But I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't fully depend on me anymore, and I'm trying to make my peace with it. I just realized that I've only went out to meet someone 4 times for these past 2 years. I've never really been outgoing anyways, because I've always been shy and very introverted, but I still used to enjoy meeting people sometimes. And I remembered that at least prior to the Risperidone, I felt motivated enough to rebel against my crazy witch of a mother and find creative ways to sneak out so that I could have fun for like half an hour. Now, there's not even any of that left. Even things as simple as playing music or eating chocolate don't bring me any kind of minimal temporary satisfaction anymore. I have completely lost my sense of humor, and I can only use what's left of my creativity only when I get hysterically sad enough that I feel the need to express it in a more healthy way, like singing or drawing, instead of doing something self-destructive. I feel outrageously depersonalized, and no, I'm not recovered from my food restrictions and terrible body image. I actually feel even uglier. I don't want to even begin describing what an agony I was in when I got off the Risperidone and realized how much weight it had made me gain. When I got off of it, I'd gained around 44 pounds or 20 kilograms, and I've never been that heavy to begin with. And for someone who's dealing with anorexia, gaining as little as 0.5 kilograms feels like the end of the world. Combined with body dysmorphia, it's unbelievably hard to deal with. And as I mentioned, I was still eating super low calorie. I wasn't told that I'll gain weight either, and yes, Risperidone does make you gain weight even if there are no diet and or exercise changes because it messes up some of your hormones and most importantly, fucks up your cortisol and blood sugar levels. Tons of people have actually gotten diabetes from Risperidone. I spent probably a year running away from the mirror and crying every single time I got reminded of the fact that I had gained so much weight thanks to a drug that only worsened everything that I was dealing with and caused me a bunch of other horrendous problems. So yeah, just let that sink in. I honestly have no idea how I managed to find the willpower to not go batshit crazy this time. I've lost about 8 kilograms or 17 pounds and am maintaining them now while actually eating normally. I've always been naturally thin, but that in itself is so terribly hard for me. I'm technically still underweight, but drastic weight gain of any kind is the safest way to make someone from an eating disorder jump off a cliff or immediately relapse and die from starvation in the meantime out of immense paranoia that they're gonna gain all of that weight unexpectedly out of nowhere again. Right now, I just don't look at myself. I feel like the ugliest thing in the world, and regardless of how many compliments I receive, it doesn't matter because I don't feel pretty. Now that the drug has changed my state of mind so drastically too, I find it so stupidly hard to hold on to what's left of me. Also, there are other things that I didn't have problems with prior to taking the Risperidone. I have a harder time reacting to social cues. I sometimes cannot word my thoughts at all, like I actually cannot form sentences properly. I have also become incredibly nihilistic and have completely lost my sense of self and my purpose. I'll have to graduate at 20 and I've lost all my chances of going to an Ivy League college, or Oxford or Cambridge if I were to study in the UK, which had been a goal of mine for so many years now, and I could have easily done that if the Risperidone had not messed me up so much and ruined my academic career too. I endured so much abuse at home. I found it so hard to keep on going and work hard on myself, my abilities, and my knowledge for such a long time, only for all of it to get wasted over an incorrectly prescribed drug. Oh, and I almost forgot, math became unbelievably hard for me, and beforehand I actually had advanced math classes and I perfectly learned all of what you need to learn up until 12th grade. And here I am in 11th grade, genuinely struggling with basic problems and exercises that were unbelievably easy to solve for me. I sometimes start reading a normal sentence out of a book and cannot understand what I am reading unless I read it over and over again 3 times. This is something that I've also never had an issue with. And it's been 2 years since I stopped using Risperidone, and these side effects aren't going away. I have no idea what to do with my future, and honestly, I don't want to do anything at all. How am I supposed to go to a therapist and explain what my problems are? 3 school counselors already have given me, apart from BDD, anorexia, and depression, 3 completely different diagnoses. One said that I'm probably schizoid, the other one said that I probably have a high-functioning Asperger's, and the third one thinks that I am bipolar, 2nd type. I don't even know what these things have in common, but if they are contradictory, I won't be surprised because what I'm experiencing doesn't make any sense and is literally the definition of abnormal. Honestly, I don't know anymore. How am I supposed to distinguish traits that were caused by the risperidone and still haven't gotten away between traits that have occurred due to one of these diagnoses? Surprise, there is no way. Because for whatever reason, risperidone's long-term side effects haven't even been studied. I do nothing but stay and read at home, wasting away most of my days, sometimes either feeling nothing, sometimes being severely depressed, and sometimes both. It all began in the summer of '95 when I was 14 years old when I started shooting heroin. I had no father, and my mother was an abusive wretch who had rather die than spend a single minute around. After several months of smoking crack, a girl that I knew introduced me to heroin. She got the needle ready, put it in my arm, injected the liquid, and holy shit, it was the best feeling ever. It was like a full body and mind orgasm times 1,000. I don't know, you really have to experience it yourself to comprehend it. Anyway, after several years of shooting dope and working a shitty job at a convenience store, in 2003, a friend of mine, who we'll call B, hit me up telling me that he knew a guy who had this drug that could produce euphoria more powerful than the first time he tried heroin. He told me that this guy was not only the biggest crackhead west of the Mississippi, but he also had ready access to all different types of drugs, from volatile inhalants and stimulants like top quality meth and coke, all the way to research psychedelics, entactogens, and deliriants. During this time, the only drugs that I had used so far were heroin and oxycodone. I was interested, so I asked what the drug was. He just chuckled and said, "You'll see," as he beckoned me to his car. I had the day off, so I got into his car and we drove for about an hour until we arrived at an older house with an old Ford pickup parked in front of it. We got out and went to the front door and knocked. This guy, C, who looked like a disheveled version of Norman Reedus, answered the door. He was obviously hyped up on some kind of stimulant as he began speed talking about a hydrocarbon that feels like heaven while looking up at the sky. I began laughing at his odd behavior as we walk in. I asked him what this drug was and he ran out of the room and came back later holding a canister with the text R22 on it. He said it was called Freon and said that it was like a combination of heroin and PCP, minus the psychosis and mania. He handed me a balloon and told me to connect the balloon to the canister. Ignoring the giant-ass "do not inhale" sign on the front of the canister, I did so, and he then said to put the balloon to your mouth and begin exhaling and inhaling like you would with nitrous oxide. I detached the balloon and began huffing. I took a hit, and holy shit, this stuff was like the rush I got from my first heroin injection multiplied 100-fold. It was at that point that heroin lost its magic, and I knew that Freon would be my new drug of choice. Looking back on it, this was probably the biggest mistake I have ever made. Considering how many drugs this guy somehow had access to, I should have asked for some 2CB or something, not this shit. Anyway, after the rush faded, which probably lasted for about 2 to 4 minutes, I passed the balloon to my friend, who began huffing. We then refilled the balloon and I went first. I took 4 hard hits, and euphoria washed over me once more, even more intense than before, as my vision faded to a greenish cyan color. My friends were laughing, the pitch of their voice was dipping from high to low, and I immediately saw myself from the third person. I was standing, wobbling like an old person. I then took the perspective of the television, which was right across from the sofa we were at. Everything suddenly turned to a red color as B jumped atop the sofa and yelled, "I'm the king of the world!" and then jumped off, falling on his ass and making a loud-ass bang in the process. C began laughing his ass off as B hobbled up and began huffing again. I was then struck with a feeling of paranoia as I was scared that I was doomed to be a TV for the rest of my existence, that this was my punishment for hedonism. A few minutes later, I came to. I was still standing, but I was dizzy as hell and had a slight headache. C passed me the balloon and I took 2 more huffs. I didn't trip again, but I was filled with confusion. B said something along the lines of, "Bro, imagine huffing Freon while tripping on Benadryl." Though I knew what Benadryl was, my Freon-riddled mind had no idea what he was talking about, so I responded with, "Benadryl? What's Benadryl? Benadryl? Benodrel? Wait, no, I bent a drill." The rest of the night went on like this, as I took about a dozen or so more hits, but not in succession. I probably would have died if I took 12 hits in a row. A few hours later, B drove me home as a tingly feeling radiated throughout my body. The next day, I craved Freon more than I ever craved heroin. I craved this Freon so much that I would be willing to be flagellated, crucified, then boiled alive 5 times over just to get it. I did some research and found out that Freon was easily accessible through AC units. I called up B and told him to meet me at the local church. The church had multiple AC units as it turned out. We went there and began huffing. I took 5 hits and I felt a euphoric rush accompanied by a feeling of shrinking at an extreme speed. I shrunk down to the size of a quark. Everything around me looked completely alien as I took the size of an elementary particle. It looked absolutely stunning and I wanted to stay there forever. I wandered around for a few hours, but then some other quarks came over and began talking to me. "Holy shit, where did you come from?" one of the quarks exclaimed. "Dude, what the hell are you doing? Why the absolute fuck would you inhale hydrocarbons? What the hell is wrong with you?" another exclaimed. The quarks were right. They were trying to help me. I knew what they were saying and I knew they were right, but I didn't care. The euphoria was too much. I then began growing again, and I was horrified that I would no longer exist in that perfect world I was in. After the trip ended, I found myself lying on the pavement, looking up at the sun. I got up and looked at my watch. It had only been 2 minutes, even though the trip felt like it lasted hours. I hobbled over to the AC and started huffing again. I took 6 hits and looked behind me. There was an 18-wheeler parked by the church, and it suddenly transformed into a giant robot. The robot began laughing at me for how stupid I was and how I would go nowhere in life, all while bearing the most terrifying grin I'd ever seen on any living thing. Then, just like that, the trip ended. My next experience happened 2 days later. I bought myself a canister of Freon R22 and some balloons. As soon as I got home, I unboxed the canister and began huffing. I took 7 hits. Euphoria hit me as usual, and everything took on a 16-bit look. I became confused as I interacted with the things around my house. Every time I touched the wall, there was a pixelated ripple effect on it. Same thing with everything else I touched. I walked over to the bedroom and opened the door. The entire room was still 16-bit, but it was in a black and white color. There was a person who sort of resembled Toad from Super Mario sitting on my bed. He told me, "You're locked to the cold. Please end this." I didn't know what he meant. Suddenly, everything began fading, and after 10 seconds of blackness, I heard the Toad guy yell, "Don't wake up! Don't wake up! Don't wake up! Awaken or cease to be! Don't wake up! I beg of you!" I woke up, picked up the balloon, refilled it, and started huffing again. After 2 huffs, I heard a knock on the door. It was B. I let him in and gave him a balloon. We then began huffing. I took 6 hits, and another trip began. I felt a euphoric rush and noticed that my PS2 took on a human shape like the 18-wheeler did and began dancing. I looked over to my friend and told him that he had to see this. He looked at the dancing PS2. I then began laughing. I was laughing so hard I could have had a stroke. After several minutes of laughing, the trip then ended, as did the euphoria. I started huffing again and a new trip began. The PS2 was still standing there, talking to me. It said, "You are," and then said, "Here are we," in a loud, booming voice. I turned around and walked out of the home. I looked up to the sky and saw a shit ton of UFOs and aliens slowly falling to the ground. The aliens pulled out laser blasters and began destroying the cars and homes. I sat there, watching the destruction happen. Suddenly, the trip ended, and I had the worst headache ever, accompanied by severe rebound anxiety. I began huffing again, and this time I actually passed out. This next experience was the last Freon trip I had. This time I was with some friends of mine, including B, at a house party near my home. Most of the kids there were in college, but some were still in high school. Most of them weren't doing any drugs, but the ones that were using more tame drugs such as beer, MDMA, cocaine, or LSD. Meanwhile, B and I, as well as 2 others, were huffing Freon in the backyard near a bonfire. I took 10 hits in succession, everything went black, and then my vision faded from blue to red about 50 times, and then I found myself in what looked like a hallway. The walls were made of metal and the floors were black. I turned around and saw about a dozen dark red figures. They began talking, one after another. The first one said, "No!" The second, "Cursed." The third, "You doomed yourself." The fourth, "Why did you kill us all?" I was terrified. I thought these beings would kill me. I started running, and I realized that this hallway was actually a maze. I just ran at full speed. I just continued running for what felt like millions of years. No joke, it literally felt like millions of years passed during this trip. I ran, and the red figures were chasing, yelling various insults at me. After another million years of running, the trip apparently ended. I woke up next to the bonfire, and it actually took me about 30 minutes to comprehend that millions of years did not pass, as it legit felt like millions of years. I asked B how long I was out for, and he said about a minute and a half. I picked up another balloon and began huffing again, and I was right back into the same maze. I began running again as the same red figures were chasing me, threatening to kill me. A few million years then passed, and then everything went black, and my body went numb. I then heard a beeping sound, and as soon as the beeping sound started, the message, "Warning, body temperature below 95 degrees, in red text with the red triangle warning sign beside it flashed for about 15 times before everything faded to a blood red color as I felt pain that was on par with a cluster headache throughout my entire head. A few seconds later, I began experiencing psychedelic-like visuals as the pain quickly faded into euphoria, this rush being the most powerful one yet. Despite the powerful euphoric rushes I've had prior to this one, there's no adequate word in any known language on the planet to describe how utterly at peace I felt. Then it clicked in my head that I was dying. I just laid there, ready and excited to accept my fate. Then, a moment of clarity hit me. I didn't want to die. I was only 22 years old. I know I was hopelessly addicted to shit, but I still had potential, so much to do. Faintly, I heard B yell, "Shit, shit, shit, he's foaming, call an ambulance now." I then heard echoed yelling of what sounded like paramedics yelling a bunch of medical jargon. I still couldn't see, but the feeling of relief was unreal. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor came in a few minutes later and told me that my lungs were nearly destroyed and that my internal body temperature was only 79 degrees, a dangerously low level, and had I gone without treatment for even a few more minutes, I would have died from cardiac arrest or a brain freeze, a literal brain freeze. He then asked me how many times I had huffed Freon, and I told him that I lost count, that it was so addictive that it was impossible to keep track. He then told me that it was nothing short of a miracle that I didn't die from hypothermia, internal frostbite, or hypoxia, and that it was also a miracle that I was still able to think and talk coherently, considering how many brain cells perished during my huffing sessions. It was also a miracle that I didn't fall and fracture my skull or some shit while under the influence. He then said due to my addictive personality that I should check into an addiction program as soon as I'm discharged. I met B at the same program and told him that I was quitting Freon and heroin. He said he was doing the same. My psychiatrist prescribed low-dose benzodiazepines to deal with the anxiety from withdrawal, and the addiction program went well. I still got cravings, but they aren't as intense as they used to be. I was eventually able to get off the heroin and the Freon and got myself a job and a car. I'm doing pretty well for myself now, and me and B are still friends. As deadly as Freon was, it taught me an invaluable lesson, a lesson I should have learned long before I touched it, and it gave me one of the most precious gifts that one could ask for, a chance at a new start. I've been clean of heroin and Freon for over a decade now. I still enjoy drugs, however. I smoke weed once a week and pop the occasional acid tab or 2CB tablet, but I no longer shoot dope or huff dangerous hydrocarbons. Take this from me, never huff anything. Never, ever huff anything, period. Use literally anything else. Sniff some coke, shoot some ketamine, smoke a joint, or pop a molly. You're better off doing any other drug than huffing volatile solvents. I learned that the hard way, and it could happen to you. Again, never huff anything. Your body will thank you. Trust me. I've been battling depression and anxiety for years, but this month was especially terrible. After losing my job, ending a serious relationship, and dropping all of my college classes, I was finding it nearly impossible to fall asleep. The past few nights I've been up until 6 a.m. crying. Last night, not wanting to go through that again, I asked my neighbor if he had Xanax or anything to help me fall asleep. He told me he had some antidepressants that he was prescribed to help him sleep. I looked up the medication, Trazodone, and figured that would be perfect. He gave me about 8 100-milligram pills and advised me to take 2 of them. I went home and took the 2 100-milligram pills right away with some water. I immediately crawled into bed, turned off all the lights, and put on a TV show. It was almost midnight. After 10 or 15 minutes, my crying stopped. I felt my limbs getting heavier, and it felt like I was a stuffed animal. Fuzzy, motionless, heavy. I was very prepared to fall asleep. This was the only enjoyable part of my experience, and after this, I lost track of how time was passing. About 20 minutes in, I was starting to see things out of the corner of my eye. It looked like things were moving behind my curtains, but when I turned to check, they disappeared. I tried to focus on the TV instead, but found that the main character looked exactly like my recent ex. It was like watching him on the screen. It was freaking me out, so I turned off the TV and put on my favorite audiobook. At this point, I closed my eyes and found that I was having insane visuals of what was happening in the story. It's unusual for me to picture scenes and characters so well in my mind's eye, so I let it happen. At first, I was just watching the characters as if it were a movie, very realistic. But at one point, the characters began to warp from balloon-like characters back to realistic, and then these dark, willowy figures. I'd never envisioned this book as dark, but suddenly it was terrifying. The characters would be talking to each other and then suddenly look directly at me. I knew I was only picturing them in my mind, but it felt like they were standing directly in front of me, turning to stare me in the eyes. I had to turn the audiobook off. Now I was sitting in my bed in complete darkness and silence. I was suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating and how incredibly thirsty I was. All I wanted was water. It seemed like it took me half an hour to pick myself up out of bed and stumble down the stairs to my kitchen. I drank some water, didn't feel much better, and went back upstairs to my bed. The darkness of my room seemed evil to me. If I kept my eyes open, I would see dark shadows darting across my walls, and if I closed them, the visions would be worse. Skulls flying in front of my face, an alien monster-like creature walking towards me. Eventually, I found that I was able to push these thoughts away until they were static in the corner of my field of vision. It was a mental battle between evil thoughts and seeing nothing at all. By now, it was probably 1:30 a.m., but it felt much longer than an hour. I was suddenly aware of noises coming from the downstairs of my house. I was paralyzed with fear. I could actually hear people's voices below me. I wanted to get up and check, but my heart was racing and my limbs were too weak. I lay there panicking for a few minutes, convinced that my house was being robbed. After a while, I managed to drag myself to the window and realized that it was only my next-door neighbors loudly drinking in their backyard. Overwhelmed with relief, I was finally able to start drifting off into sleep. The sleep was unsettling. I had a very vivid and intense dream, but could not remember it upon waking. I think I woke up a few times during the night, dry sobbing and feeling sick. This morning, I woke up just in time to make my doctor's appointment, 10:30 a.m. I felt groggy, weak, nauseous, and my head was furiously pounding. I figured these symptoms would go away once I was a little more awake. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I had purple bags under my eyes, and it looked like my face was melting. I found myself crying before I left my house, a combination of feeling sick and immediately thinking about my ex. Driving was extremely difficult. I had to use 2 hands just to turn the key in the ignition. My vision was blurry and I had trouble staring at the same spot for more than a few seconds. Halfway through my drive, I began to regret getting into my car. It was incredibly hard to focus, and my headache got worse with each passing minute. It's now almost 2 p.m. and I'm back in bed. My headache is worse than ever. I feel sick to my stomach, and I don't even recognize myself in the mirror. It's a beautiful day, but I'm stuck inside trying not to cry because it makes me feel even sicker. This experience was definitely not worth it for me. I regret taking 2 of the pills and probably should have started off with half of one. I'm not very experienced with psychedelics. I only had 1 DMT trip and it was pleasant, so the hallucinations were very scary and unexpected. I believe Trazodone may be very helpful for some, but I plan on flushing the other 6 pills. Before I start, I just want to say that this Lyrica was actually the first drug I ever did, even before weed. The only thing I remember from it is I took it in school and I couldn't keep my balance. I was holding onto the wall and everything. It was fucking insane to me at the time. Haven't done it since, and that was what, 9 years ago now? 10 years ago almost? So yeah, that's my experience with it. I'd love to create my own report for it, but that's all I remember from it. And yeah, it was a fun time. So as long as you're safe with these kind of drugs, you probably won't have a problem. But don't overdo it like these fucking idiots. I've been on many drugs, opiates continuously since 2003, Suboxone since 2005. Had my share of illegal opiates including heroin, cocaine, weed, salvia, acid, ecstasy, DMT, nootropics, but the first drug that ever aged me was Kava. Living in Australia, I first tried Kava from the supermarket. It got me high but rapidly made me sick. My body, all my tissues would reek of it, and it's a nauseating smell. Then my local Fijian shop had raw Kava that was fine but weak. Then the local head shop had it slightly better. I bought kilo tubs of it for months to years in 2007 to 8. Then it was legally restricted in Australia somewhat. Northern Territory cops would even brag of raids catching cars full of it as if it was a real drug. But then in 2021, I saw it on shelves of pharmacy and health food stores. I bought 1 jar and ate 10 caps. I went to a work meeting stoned, pupils like pinholes. Wow, I thought, this stuff actually works. Not just like any old Kava, like coke and benzos at the same time. Plus, it wouldn't flunk a drug test. But I got sick. People asked what's up. I wouldn't have looked good in a work meeting. Now, 2.5 years later, I've been taking Kava every single day, approximately 20 caps a day. I've only had about a month off the whole time. Kava is a strange and misunderstood drug. People think it's GABAergic, yes it is, but discrete molecules within are cannabinomimetic, adrenergic, lowering blood pressure, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, antidepressant, and most interesting of all, dopamine reuptake inhibiting, yes, like coke. I bet there's a connection between sodium channel blockers and dopamine in Kava because two other locally numbing drugs, coke and nifopam, are local anesthetics which block sodium channels and dopamine reuptake inhibitors. Kava contains a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, and crude kava has local anesthetic effects. Kava is a poison. Your body cries out from smell to taste to body load, just one long cry of distaste at the whole indignity of being subjected to kava. It makes my body feel so bad, but my brain feels so good for the first 30 minutes. Then all you can do is lie in bed, not relaxed, just cold, tired, and exhausted. But that first 30 minutes sucks me in. I began doing daily unethical or at least embarrassing and improper things to get my kava. Many days I take 30 or 4 caps. The label says not to exceed 1 per day. I lamely try to console myself that I did stick to 1 bottle per day, but the label meant 1 pill. Strangely, after much trial and error, I found all but 1 brand caused no true euphoria at all, and even the good brand, not all batches did, but 1 batch of the right brand always paid off. I kept going while I lost my relationship, my health, my looks went to shit, and my job to my fiendish habit. I rotated every single pharmacy in the city that had my brand, plus about 15 plus surrounding suburbs, cleared them all out. My skin is peeling, my liver aches, but what can I say? I'm strung out. I did it all through jury duty. After losing my job, I've spent $9,000 of my severance on kava shopping. My house is littered with empty bottles rolling underfoot. I'd buy 1, crack the lid, drop 20 in one go with a gulp of water, swallowing 10 at a time. I've lost my appetite, gone from 83 kilograms to 63. No energy, I can't join family or friends to do anything on a weekend. I've lost 1 good relationship I found despite my addiction, and it's embarrassing to admit. Drug counselors have no clue. But in that first 30 minutes after it hits, I'm on top of the world. I am under 40, but now I've got a big gray patch only since kava. My face is lined and haggard. I am weak and sporadically nauseous, perpetual stomach cramps and bloating. When it works, you just feel confident, relaxed, and unstoppable. Go without, I shake, I'm crabby, irritable, anxious, frankly scared, and all I can think of is cravings. Worst of all, I finally cleaned out the supply of good stuff. It must have been a fluke, just 1 good plantation somewhere in the Pacific or 1 good year. Occasionally I'll find a jar soon to be remaindered in the back of a small suburban pharmacy, and it's that old magic. But now my travel and search has gone well over 20-minute train rides. But I'm still so hopelessly addicted, I still take the shitty, non-fun leftovers that only leave me feeling sick with no euphoria. I'm like an abandoned dog waiting by an empty bowl after its owner moved away, yet I still buy this useless shit. I believe the dopamine reuptake inhibitor component is a molecule called coane, no E on the end. I keep thinking, should this stuff be over the counter? What can I say? I am strung out. I have done a lot of psychedelics in my time, including some pretty heroic doses, but nothing could have prepared me for the last trip that I ever had, and likely ever will have. At the time of this trip, I was actively selling mushrooms, so had basically infinite access to this stuff. I had set a zip aside out of this pound for personal use, and started with the pretty intense but very enjoyable 7-gram trip that had me wearing my girlfriend's safari hat, riding couch cushions, and crawling around the floor pretending to be Steve Irwin. Then being so fucked up that I spent an hour trying to put the couch cushions back on before giving up and letting my girlfriend handle it when she got home. I had so much fun that the next day I decided to do it again and wanted an even more intense trip. I remembered how when I was taking acid, I'd have to basically double my dosage each day, otherwise I wouldn't trip due to how fast tolerance builds with psychedelics. I'm not sure why I thought that eating the rest of the ounce was a good idea, but I figured it would be a slightly more intense trip, yet still be quite enjoyable. Boy was I wrong. I ate the 21 grams pretty quick. I'd say within a minute or two they were gone. Almost instantly, my body started to feel pretty weird, and I can tell they were already kicking in. I went outside to smoke a cigarette, hoping to calm myself because already I could feel the anxiety rising and knew that I might have fucked up. As I am standing on the balcony smoking my cigarette, I looked down at the grass and everything was swirling, almost like a vortex. It looked as if the ground could open up as some kind of black hole at any minute, so I went inside. My girlfriend put on a movie and I sat next to her trying to relax. Maybe 5 minutes into the movie, I start rubbing my hair, thinking it felt very weird. Then I began feeling my clothes and my skin and started to panic. I remember saying, "Nothing is real." Then my girlfriend turned to me and said, "What are you talking about?" I jumped up off the couch pacing the living room, saying that nothing was real and that this wasn't real life. My hair felt like yarn and my clothes felt like paper. Everything around me slowly turned into some kind of cartoon, like an 80s to 90s fever dream kind of cartoon. Although panicked, I tried to roll with it and enjoy the experience. I sat back down and kept feeling my hair, then my beard. My beard felt shorter than it did before, as did my chest hair, which made me believe that I was aging backwards and soon I would become a fetus, then cease to exist entirely. It wasn't uncommon for me to have insane thoughts like this on heroic doses. However, unlike other times, I couldn't convince myself that this wasn't true. I immediately told my girlfriend that I needed an ambulance because I took so many shrooms that I had reversed my aging and they had to have a way to fix it. Now, due to the fact that I was a drug dealer at the time and had copious amounts of mushrooms and pot in the house, as well as a few less than legal firearms, she of course said no and tried to calm me down with a shower. This made the situation much worse because I was aware of all my body hair and believed it to be getting shorter. I told her to call my mom because she would know what to do, which she also refused, as well as taking my phone from me. This made me extremely paranoid because I was convinced that she was trying to make sure this process continued. She called some friends on my phone to see if they could help calm me down, which also didn't work because it made me believe they were somehow in on it. The phone call ended and she was texting them on my phone, and I saw her smile, which sealed the paranoia for me. I saw a glimpse of her as a witch and realized that it was her that was causing the reversed aging effect. I of course called her out on this, and she said I was acting crazy and really needed to calm down. At this point, she got me out of the bath and was drying me off, which caused the thought to occur, I'm basically brain dead now. She's having to take care of me because I'm now incapable of even bathing myself. This freaked me out because I thought I'd be like this forever and thought that I'd seriously fucked my brain up. At this point, I also still believed that I was subconsciously suicidal and was worried that I would end up killing myself without meaning to. I can't even explain the layers of thinking going on at this point. Thoughts were overlapping each other, and it's like I was thinking of 6+ different thoughts at once, all perfectly coherent, which was extremely overwhelming. My situation continued to deteriorate, so she suggested I try to induce vomiting. This felt like an amazing light bulb moment, a stroke of genius. I remember laughing and saying something along the lines of course, it's so simple." I ran to the bathroom and shoved my fingers down my throat all the way to the knuckle. I hadn't eaten anything other than mushrooms in over 24 hours, so what came out was like black sludge with mushroom powder. Somehow, this actually made the trip intensify. Blue, green, and yellow lights pulsed in the bathroom, and the toilet wouldn't stay still. I kept trying to throw up despite the fact that my last 3 attempts resulted in nothing but dry heaves. My girlfriend convinced me to stop trying and just lie down in bed with her. We lied down in bed and I felt myself begin to float out of my body, so I gripped her tight and said, "Don't let me go, I'm not ready to die yet." What happened next felt like some kind of extremely intense spiritual battle to keep my soul inside of my body, floating away then pulling myself back in over and over. I was convinced that machine elves had come to collect my soul and take me back to the spirit world, which I was not ready to go to yet. Once my soul felt secured in my body, I started to feel a little more calm. I suggested we sit in the living room and put No Rain by Blind Melon on. The song and video has always been a source of comfort for me on intense trips. I finally began enjoying the insane level of visuals I had, but it didn't last long. Before the song was even over, I closed my eyes, which turned out to be a terrible idea. I saw what I could only describe as a video game cutscene or cinematic movie moment where the camera panned through a dark room and I saw my dad standing on a pentagram. I could feel myself becoming my dad and him becoming me. My eyes shot open and I said, "That motherfucker's trying to Freaky Friday me." This of course confused my girlfriend and she said, "What the fuck are you talking about? Who?" I said, "My dad. He's jealous because he's getting old and I'm young still, so he's trying to steal my body." She thought this was insane, which made me angry. I told her to call my mom immediately so I could tell her what was happening, and of course she refused again. At this point, I began to think that she was in on it, so I tried to distance myself from her. I went outside tripping my nuts off. Everything was twisting, twirling, breathing, and covered in indescribable patterns. She came outside and asked if I was okay, which I brushed off since she was aiding my dad in a satanic Freaky Friday type ritual. She was insistent on checking on me every time I went to a different room, which I guess slowly built my trust with her back up, because we ended up on the couch together listening to Smashing Pumpkins. I felt like this whole ordeal took an hour or two, but in reality it had been about 7 hours and the sun was coming up. I was still tripping pretty hard, but I felt myself gaining control over my mind again. Delusions would continue to pop up in my head, but I was able to tell myself that it wasn't real, unlike earlier where I had entirely lost grips with reality. I can say with certainty that even with bad trips and LSD-induced panic attacks in the past, I have never felt any kind of fear or panic that can even come close to comparing the 7 or 8 hours of pure terror that I felt that night. As soon as one delusion made its way out of my mind, another one would set in almost instantly. It's been about 2 years since that trip, and I still have no intentions of ever doing it again. To this day, even smoking pot fills me with some pretty intense paranoia and anxiety. I'm genuinely terrified of ever doing any drugs again, despite a long history of general drug abuse, because I never want to lose control of my mind or disconnect from reality again. This experience definitely scarred me, but at least it led to a positive life change, I guess.